Welcome everyone to another session of Weber Scholars Network. I'm Victor Strazzeri. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Federal University of São Paulo. It's a great pleasure to host this session. It will be, the topic today is, as part of our series on Weber and political thought, or Weber the political theorist, is the interface of intellectuals tied to the journal Socialisme, Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism, a journal published from the late 40s to the mid 60s, a journal of the communist left or the anti-Stalinist French left. These two intellectuals are Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort, and both have an interesting relationship to Weber without being Weberians, but somehow are in an intensive dialogue with him in different ways. This is what we'll be approaching today as part of this interesting topic of, let's say, left-wing or libertarian readers of Weber. People are fascinated by Weber from the anarchists, from the left communists, from socialist circles. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. We have Yannkis Ktenas, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the National and Kapodistrian University in Greece. And we also have Pedro Magalhães, who is an assistant professor in political science at the Universidade do Minho in northern Portugal, where I'm also at the moment, so we're not that far. But without further ado, so Yannkis will start speaking and talk about Castoriadis' relationship with Weber. Pedro will focus on Lefort. They will have a short conversation, and we will open the floor to questions after that. So, Yannkis, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Victor. I'm very happy to be here tonight to discuss with you in this topic, and I also want to thank publicly Pedro for accepting to participate in this discussion with us and to organize this event together. So as Victor already pointed out, I'm going to refer to the intellectual relationship between Weber and Castoriadis. Castoriadis was a philosopher who was born in Greece in 1922, but left for Paris in his early 20s. He starts as a radical Marxist, but later on he develops his own political, psychoanalytical, and ontological philosophy with his magnum opus, which is called The Imaginary Institution of Society, being published in 1975. Politically speaking, Castoriadis remains until the end of his life a radical critic of capitalism. He is in favor of direct democracy, self-organized institutions, and self-managed production units. Under this light, his intellectual affinity with Weber seems rather bizarre and unexpected. However, from this respect, he makes part of this broader discussion we have this year, this season in the network on what are the reasons that so many radical intellectuals are so deeply interested in Weber's work, both as Weber himself was alive and after his death. So, despite these political divergences, Castoriadis speaks very often of Weber, always in a tone of great respect. Actually, as we will see, both the first and the last text he published while he was alive, Castoriadis, were dedicated to Weber's work. But let me take things in order, or rather in reverse order, and I'll try to show you why. So, in 1988, 13 years after the publication of his famous work on the imaginary institution, Castoriadis publishes in the French critical journal Esprit a book review on Philippe Renaud, Max Weber et le dilemme de la raison moderne. This really good book of Philippe Renaud. Actually, I think it was his dissertation. So Max Weber and the dilemmas of the modern reason. Castoriadis reviews this book for the journal Esprit. There, after praising Renaud's book, he decides to settle some issues with Weber himself. Although he states his admiration for Weber's work, Castoriadis tries to distance himself from him, and he presents his own philosophy as a way out of Weber's dead ends. But what are these dead ends according to Castoriadis? Generally speaking, Castoriadis attributes to Weber what he calls a rationalistic, methodological, but also ontological individualism. Of course, Castoriadis is aware of Max Weber's warning against the ungeheures Missverständnis, the terrible misunderstanding, which consists in trying to make an ontology out of Weber's methodological approach in the field of sociology. However, Castoriadis is not convinced by this warning. According to him, when Weber speaks of the social or of the collective formations, his, and this is a quote, his expressions are so categorical that it can immediately be seen that if the individual method does not involve taking an evaluative and still less a political position, it is nevertheless tantamount to an ontological decision concerning the being of the social historical. And Castoriadis quotes Weber, for the interpretative and understanding of behavior, these social collectivities must be treated as solely the resultants and modes of organization of the particular acts of individual persons, since for us, those alone can be treated as comprehensive agents of meaning-oriented action. That's the end of the quote. Then, Castoriadis identifies a serious problem in the Weberian conception of meaning, of Sinn. According to this interpretation, Weber cannot overcome his inscription in a Kantian and neo-Kantian tradition. As a result, Weber can only perceive meaning as the creation of an individual subject. And here follows a quote by Castoriadis. If there is meaning, it is because there is a subject, an ego, that posits it, intends it, constitutes it, constructs it, etc. And if there is a subject, it is because it is either the source and unique origin of meaning or meaning's necessary correlate. This is the end of the quote. Prisoner of such an egological conception of meaning, Weber cannot grasp the essence of the social world, according to Castoriadis. He is intellectually obliged to present the social historical as a product of the interaction, cooperation, and or conflict of individual agents, right? So what can we say of these critical remarks by Castoriadis? I think that they are characterized by an element that characterizes the way Castoriadis practiced philosophical criticism in general. They are somewhat exaggerative, but at the same time, they also contain a core of truth. It is true that Weber often subscribes to an individualistic approach of the social world, and this is extremely difficult, and also it is extremely difficult to separate the methodology of social sciences from an explicit or implicit ontology of the social world. However, we know that this is not the whole picture. For example, and this is an interpretative gesture made by a lot of scholars, including myself, but also Philippe Renaud, the book of whom Castoriadis supposedly presents there. So this interpretative gesture consists in shifting the focus on Weber's writings on the sociology of religions. There, we can notice a shift towards a far more sociocentric approach to the concept of meaning. There, Weber speaks of its word religion as a sinnvoller Kosmos, a universe of meaning, which is of course not a product of individual choices. Quite to the contrary, inside this universe of meaning, we have to place each time the individual action and the various forms of rationality. So the question is here, could we just end up to the conclusion that Castoriadis simply ignores these dimensions of Weber's work? This is certainly not the case. To prove this, let me take you even earlier back in the Nazi-occupied Athens of 1943. 44, sorry. Castoriadis is then 22 years old, and he is studying law in the University of Athens. This is a common point, another common point between Castoriadis and Weber. Their first degree was in law. So in the University of Athens, the law school of University of Athens, Castoriadis' professor in philosophy of law is Konstantinos Tsatsos. Konstantinos Tsatsos was later on to become president of the Greek democracy, but what is more important for us is that Tsatsos had completed his PhD with Heinrich Rickert, with Rickert acknowledging him as the student who applied best his theory in the field of law. So Konstantinos Tsatsos, a pupil of Heinrich Rickert himself, is a very favorite professor of Castoriadis. At the same time, Ioannis Ikoutris, a major philologist and translator who was a friend of Castoriadis' family, offered the first Greek translation of Weber. It was a translation of Vicent Safdal's Beruf, the Science as a Vocation. Against such a background, Castoriadis, who was a very charismatic person, the story has it that he read Plato's Symposium by the age of 12, is asked to edit a volume of a Greek journal of social sciences. So in this volume, Castoriadis' own contribution, which is also the first theoretical publication of his life, consists of a carefully annotated Greek translation of the 11 first paragraphs of Weber's Economy and Society, along with an introduction in social sciences written by Castoriadis himself. In this text of the 22 years old Castoriadis, we find a very different approach towards Weber's ideas. Let me read you some passages that are quite telling from this respect. Castoriadis says, Weber served the investigation of the logical foundations of social sciences with indelible offers. The definite and clear conception of social meaning as a constitutive moment of the material of social sciences. The corresponding to this conception determination of the main mission of sociology, which is the understanding of social phenomena. I move forward to a second passage. Castoriadis says, the elucidation of the meaningful character of the social, though not its adequate foundation, was performed in the end of the last century by Dilthey, Rickert, but finally by Max Weber himself. While the two former turned to the difference of the method between natural and historical science, Max Weber clearly discerned the main features of the historical material from the features of the natural material. The historical phenomenon is always bearer of meaning, as opposed to the bare from meaning natural phenomenon. And then a final quote, a final passage. This could easily be multiplied, but you get the point. Castoriadis writes, the hidden nerve of Max Weber's argumentation against all deviations is this. The possibility of value reference is the constitutive precondition of the social object. After we have accepted this possibility of value reference, the social science enters its main work, interpretative understanding and causal explanation of the social phenomenon. These passages and many others, unfortunately, remain rather unknown because they are, for the most part, untranslated or poorly translated from Greek. Something that makes sense to a certain extent, since they are comments in a Greek translation of a German text. So it would be rather paradoxical to retranslate these Greek comments of a Greek translation of a German text to back to other languages. However, what's more impressive is not the distance that separates these early writings of the 22-year-old Castoriadis from his later views. I think these are rather the product of a certain intellectual aspiration to distance oneself from the thinkers that have influenced us very deeply. What is most impressive is that the young Castoriadis does not even have to recur to Weber's sociology of religion in order to trace the social element in Weber's thought. Even in the 11 first paragraphs of Economy and Society, which admittedly are among the most individualistic writings of Weber, Castoriadis traces social meaning as the constitutive element of the social world and the social sciences. And this is ultimately the point I want to make, leaving the biographical and bibliographical analysis apart, and in order to proceed to a more philosophical analysis. To my view, the intellectual affinity between Weber and Castoriadis is based in the centrality of meaning in their work. Even when Castoriadis, at the early stages of his life, is a Marxist, as I already mentioned, he has never a monolithic and reductionist conception of the social world, exactly because he's aware of Weber's emphasis on meaning and on the plurality of the social determinants. And later on, when he moves on to develop his own theory, the theory of the imaginary institution of society, according to which the institutions of every society acquire their specificity because they incarnate and presentify a magma of socially created imaginary significations, Castoriadis further elaborates, redefines, and deepens an idea he first met at his 22 years. Of course, in Castoriadis, we find a lot of things that are not there in Weber, such as an ontology of the social world, a crucial use of psychoanalysis, a philosophy of the human creativity. However, the centrality of meaning is fundamental for him. And to give only one example, and we can later on discuss other cases, when Castoriadis talks of Western modernity, he says that that Western modernity is characterized by the entanglement of two core and antagonistic but also intertwined social imaginary significations. He calls the one of them the project of autonomy, and the other one, he calls it the pseudo-rational control over nature and society. Here, we can only recall, even at the level of vocabulary, Weber's idea of a Protestantic inner-worldly performed asceticism that aims to the rationale Beherrschung von Natur und Menschen, the rational control over nature and man. Whether we talk about politics and the problems of legitimization, whether we talk about modernity, and whether we talk about what constitutes the social universe, I believe this is my argument that both in Weber and in Castoriadis' writings, in ways that from some perspectives are quite similar, from other perspectives differ, we will find meaning as the key element we have to focus on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yannis, for your talk, and go directly to Pedro for his commentary on Weber and Claude Lefort.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation of the Weber Scholars Network. It's a pleasure to be here again. Last month it was a session on Weber and Carl Schmitt. Today a session on Weber and the founders of Socialisme and Barbarie. So we basically cover the whole political spectrum, the very most opposite poles of the discussion within a month, which is very interesting. And also thanks to Yannis for proposing basically this session and for setting up this encounter, which I think is very interesting. The way that Weber had an influence, a very profound one, as Yannis has just showed us with regard to Castoriadis, one of the founders of Socialisme and Barbarie, but also some influence on what we could say was the other leading figure of Socialisme and Barbarie, which was the French philosopher Claude Lefort. Now, in Lefort's case, I think because Weber was not as central to the development of Lefort's thought as he was for Castoriadis. In Lefort's case, I think it would be fruitful to proceed in three different ways. So, in the first instance, I will try to develop a bit and elaborate a bit on one instance and one aspect, which is the theory of bureaucracy, where indeed Lefort engages with Max Weber. And this, we can trace this precisely to the Socialisme and Barbarie milieu. So basically, if we look at this publications in Socialisme and Barbarie, and by the way, Victor, I think you are right. In the anthology, there is no text signed by a woman, or at least as far as I could gather, because some were signed by pseudonyms, but I don't think there is a text by a woman in Socialisme and Barbarie. But perhaps the main topic of Socialisme and Barbarie was precisely the question of bureaucratic domination. So the concept of bureaucracy was key for this anti-Stalinist far left. Socialisme and Barbarie actually emerges as a splinter from the International Communist Party, which was the Trotskyist party, so the branch of the Fourth International in France. They splinter because they also became critical of Trotsky himself and of his analysis of the Soviet Union. And so the concept of bureaucracy really does play a crucial role in this regard. Now, the text where Lefort refers explicitly to Weber is from the 1960s. The text is called What is Bureaucracy? Qu'est-ce que la bureaucratie? By the time that this was published, Lefort had already left the group Socialisme and Barbarie, and he published this essay in another review of the French left, journal of the French left, called Argument, which was a place where there were some vivid debates on the French left about important issues. So if we look at this text, what does Lefort actually do with Weber? Well, I think it is very clear that Weber allows Lefort to see past an understanding of bureaucracy that is very strictly determined by historical materialism. So and that is tied to a philosophy of history. So Lefort deals with conceptions of bureaucracy and especially of state bureaucracy in this case, by Hegel, by Marx. Within this framework, bureaucracy was not really central, because what was central were the relations of production. So bureaucracy didn't play a crucial role. And in that regard, it appeared basically to Marx and later also to Lenin as a parasitic phenomenon that could somehow be dealt with and that would disappear in due course. Now, Weber appears here in this context, and he turns Lefort's attention to the ubiquity and to the pervasiveness of bureaucracy as a mode of organization, and to the multiplicity also of bureaucracies in modern society. So this multiplicity, which is not restricted to the state, so bureaucracy is not merely a phenomenon that is connected with the growth of the state, but it's also connected with the development of industrial capitalism. It is also connected with the development of many mass institutions, political parties, trade unions, etc. But Weber's, and this is a quote from Lefort, formal definition of bureaucracy as a mode of organization in modern mass institutions appears to Lefort to be insufficient to understand what he terms the social being of bureaucracy. And in contrast to Weber, Lefort proposes instead what he calls a genetic definition of democracy. Now here, I think the more attentive readers of Weber might suspect that Lefort has not read more than 7 or 8 pages of Economy and Society to present this definition of Weber as merely formal, and then to propose a genetic definition instead, when the fact genetic arguments are used by Weber all the time in many pages of Economy and Society and elsewhere. So, but the move is interesting nonetheless, because it allows Lefort to shift the problem of bureaucracy from the realm of structural necessity to the realm of contingency, basically. This is what he aims at in this discussion of bureaucracy, to place this problem away from this structuralist understanding of its pervasiveness in modern societies, to a more to an approach that focuses more on the purposeful agency and the intention of bureaucracy. This seems to Lefort to be key in understanding modern bureaucratic phenomena. He notices that there is a quest to expand a bureaucratic milieu of power wherever it emerges, and that bureaucrats are engaged in this activity to expand this milieu of power within an institution and also beyond that institution if circumstances prove to be favorable. So instead of and even though of course Lefort acknowledges that there are powerful trends in modern mass societies that favor the consolidation and the expansion of bureaucracies, even though these trends exist, the phenomenon of bureaucratization should not be understood as a fatality or as something that is irreversible, unstoppable, as Weber's political writings sometimes give this impression, that this is something that is inescapable. Well, perhaps this is not really the case. There is an interplay here of structural features and contingency, and also historical circumstances. And this is where the example of Russia and the Soviet Revolution plays a key role, because for Lefort, here there was really a favorable circumstance for the expansion of a certain bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that first emerged within the party, within the Communist Party, the Leninist Party, but then precisely because of the revolution, because of the socialization of the means of production, this bureaucracy could actually expand its power and its grip upon society as a whole. And in capitalist societies, by contrast, this development of bureaucracy is in a way made more difficult because the multiplicity of bureaucracies compete against each other, and the conditions were not ripe for the emergence of this more consolidated form of bureaucratic rule. And then finally, I think it is interesting to also spend here some time on the opposition that Lefort draws, and here also departing from the Weberian analysis, the explicit opposition between bureaucracy and democracy. So for Lefort, wherever in any given institution, the progress of bureaucracy means that democracy within the institutions subsides. So there is this progress of relations of dependence, of relations of authority and domination. And this is what really characterizes bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is understood not really for Lefort as a mode of organization, but as a milieu of power and of the institution of unequal power relationships. And this can happen within specific institutions and also within society as a whole. So here, I mean, we have this relationship and this engagement, but I mean, I think that people that are familiar with Weber, they will read this article and they will probably have the strong suspicion that Lefort did not read Weber really, really carefully. So he picks up these characteristics of bureaucracy that Weber enumerates, simplifies it to a formal definition, and then opposes his own view. Well, with critical insight and also with some depth of analysis, but he's basically using Weber as a model of democracy, of bureaucracy, to which he wants to propose his own as a contrasting vision definition. And I don't know if the contrast is as stark as Lefort paints it in his article. Probably not, but we can discuss that more carefully later. Finally, there is a second point on this relationship between Lefort and Weber, which is a more indirect link.
Mama.
So, well, so was I being muted, or are you hearing me?
Yeah, we're hearing you. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
I thought I became muted at some point. So the second aspect of the relationship between Weber and Lefort that I wanted to thematize and to assess is a more indirect link. So later on in his career, when he was already when he had already left Socialisme and Barbarie, and where he had basically also pretty much retreated from the militant and activist milieu where he had been formed. So he was by the late 70s, early 80s, an established philosopher, professor of philosophy, and his main work focused on democracy and on a phenomenological account of what he termed the modern democratic revolution. And one of his main texts, The Question of Democracy, La Question de la Démocratie, from 1983, Lefort makes an interesting indirect reference to Weber. He claims that, that the reflourishment of political philosophy, which he deemed necessary, so he was basically proposing to reinvigorate political philosophy in a tradition that was focused on the notion of freedom as opposed to tyranny. So basically, a rather, one would say, classical account of political philosophy. And he saw two main enemies or two main forces, obstacles to this reflourishment. One was, and this is not surprising, one was orthodox Marxism, which of course he had been fighting for several years. But the other obstacle was what he termed modern social science, sociology. Well, let us put it, let us basically frame it as objective social science. So a social science that aspired to an ideal of objectivity an exteriority in its analysis of society. Lefort claims that this claim to objectivity of modern social science is basically impossible, that it's unachievable, because social science is immersed within society and can only acquire a certain place in society depending on the social formation where it is embedded. So in a sense, this is Lefort's point, modern social science within a democratic society must basically come to terms with the fact that it is embedded in this democratic society and that it acquires its place and its validity within this framework. But what I think is relevant in this regard is that, and where Weber comes into account, is that he refers to none other than Leo Strauss as an eloquent critique of this modern social science, and he refers explicitly to the critique that opens Leo Strauss' Natural Right and History. Now, if we have read this work, we know that the enemy of Leo Strauss in this first chapter of Natural Right and History is none other than Max Weber. This first chapter is a critique of Max Weber, a very radical critique from what a conservative point of view. So basically, someone that, I of course, oversimplifying Strauss's argument, but the idea is that, well, Weber is the intellectual ancestor of positivist social science, and he is to blame for many evils, including relativism and nihilism, etc., etc. But it is noteworthy to see that Lefort actually refers explicitly to this critique and says that, well, this is a very eloquent critique. And in a sense, I mean, if we are actually talking about this reinvigoration of political philosophy in classical terms, it is not that surprising to see Lefort side with people like Strauss, and also with Hannah Arendt in a certain respect. But it's a very different image of also Weber that is implied in this more indirect relationship. And finally, just to finish off, I want to propose something more speculative. So here there is absolutely no link between the work of Lefort and that of Max Weber concerning the nature of modern democracy. Well, this is a very important topic for Lefort, and I think it could be fruitful to use some of Lefort's main ideas concerning the nature of modern democracy to also engage with Weber's more political writings. So in our previous session, we had a critique here of Weber's concept of charisma, a critique with which I do not agree, and I explained why I did not agree in that circumstance. But I think a more fruitful critique of that concept of charisma could be drawn from some of Lefort's ideas concerning the nature of modern democracy. So Lefort very famously noted that an aspect of modern democracy, the crucial aspect of modern democracy, is what he called the dissolution of markers, certainty, and also this idea that power in a democracy becomes disembodied, and that it becomes ultimately an empty. I would say that Weber's concept of charisma, even though it refers also to the possibility of change, of revolution, so it is the revolutionary concept par excellence in Weber's sociology of domination, but it still seems to be trapped within this idea that new values, new ideas, new visions of community must be embodied somehow, and that they must find some personal incarnation of sorts. And Weber, in many of his political writings, referred to this question of Caesarism. So that the triumph of democracy is sometimes is almost always linked with the emergence of the strong personality. And what one could say, adopting a Lefortian outlook, is that this idea, this image of an embodied value, of embodied ideas, of embodied notions of change, that this is precisely what modern democracy disintegrates. So there is no possibility of embodiment. Which is not to say that there is no possibility of incarnation. So this is a very interesting distinction that Lefort does. So in the end of this article that I mentioned, The Question of Democracy, he says, regarding one of his teachers, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, that we should move from the image of the body to the image of the flesh in our phenomenological account of democracy. And I mean, it seems to me that perhaps the very notion of charisma is still pretty much linked to this metaphor of the body and of embodiment, and that this could be a critical perspective to inquire about some of the limitations of the notion of charismatic authority, especially for a politics of transformation, for a transformative politics. Well, on the other hand, of course, one could critically point out to Lefortians and to Lefort that, of course, you are always trying to find this unstable, indeterminate concept, but then, you know, politics must have some basis that is not always permeable to destabilization. And this is also a very interesting point. But I think here, both Lefort and Weber did not engage in any kind of dialogue. So Lefort doesn't seem to take Weber seriously as a theorist of democracy. Doesn't engage with him. But I think some fruitful dialogue could be established here between the two. So basically, this is my contribution. There are some direct interesting links in the earlier discussion of bureaucracy. There is this interesting connection via Lévi-Strauss and the reference to Lévi-Strauss. And then, I mean, more speculatively, we can use, I think, Lefortian categories and ideas to challenge and to problematize some of Weber's important political conceptions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pedro. That was, I mean, an intervention that with a lot of elements for us to reflect. And I welcome everyone to raise your virtual hand if you'd like to ask the question. Or should we do you guys want to have a little discussion first, perhaps?
Perhaps, yes, I would like to make some comments upon the very interesting points Pedro raised. I mean, if just to break the ice and start having a more inclusive, perhaps, conversation. So, what I would like to first to point out is that I fully support Pedro's idea to connect the engagement both founding figures of Socialisme ou Barbarie had with the topic of bureaucracy, to connect this engagement of theirs with Max Weber. That is certainly correct, and in a way they participate in a broader intellectual movement of the late 40s and so on. For example, Bruno Rizzi speaks of the bureaucratization of the world. The Frankfurt School thinkers also engage in this description of both the Western and the Eastern world in terms of, fully dominated and world, and of course also thinkers like James Burnham with the revolution of managers refer to the rising significance of bureaucracy. And from this respect, I want to say that Castoriadis too already from the years of Socialisme, Barbarie, and also in some articles they write in common, or they write when they are still friends with each other, Castoriadis and Lefort. He speaks of the modern regimes of the world in terms of bureaucratic capitalism. And I think this is a term they both use, at least in the years of Socialisme, Barbarie. We have this term of bureaucratic capitalism that for Castoriadis is dominant both in the West and in the USSR. But he says that bureaucratic capitalism in the West is fragmented, while in the USSR it is an absolute form of bureaucratic capitalism. But exactly as Pedro pointed out, bureaucracy for both of them is not a parasitic class, is not a parasitic phenomenon that could disappear or dissolve with the dissolution of class relationships, but it is a new dominant class. Bureaucracy is a new dominant class in the modern world, and exactly their originally Marxistic critique toward the USSR, because we have to say here that along with Simone Weil, they were two of the first radical critiques of the Stalinist USSR, right? They use this concept of bureaucratic capitalism with straight, direct references to Max Weber. So I totally agree with Pedro in this point, and I would like to say something also about his third point, which was extremely thought-provoking. I would say that while it is true to use Lefortian concepts to criticize Weberian concepts and vice versa, I think there is also some kind of affinity there too, because I think that for Lefort, exactly the concept of modernity and of modern democracy has to do with what Pedro already mentioned, this empty space of power, right? Nowadays, you cannot have a power that is embodied, right? And that's why he refers so often to this book about the two bodies of the king. Now we don't have this phenomenon of the literal embodiment of power in a person. And I would say that Weber, when he discusses bureaucracy, and sorry, let me say this first. And exactly because the space of power is emptied in modernity, in the later works of Lefort, we have this significance of the raising significance of representation as a form of government, because every effort of re-embodying the power could end up in absolutism, and in a way fascism and Nazism in Lefort's eyes tried to take over this empty space of modern power. So Weber, even when he speaks of the charismatic leader, he places this charismatic leader in a context, a broader context, where bureaucracy, the bureaucratic mechanism are there, and and since bureaucracy is not only, as you said, something that has to do, you know, with completing forms or with paperwork and stuff, but exactly is a form of organization of modern life. I think there is an affinity there between bureaucracy and representation, right? And that's why the later Lefort is so critical of Castoriadis' idea of direct democracy, because for him, this idea of direct democracy is based in an impossible now identification of society with itself. So Castoriadis tries to place society itself in the center, at the center of the empty space of power. So in this respect, I think there is absolutely a connection, and it can also be a critical connection, but also a connection where Lefort's and Weber's arguments reinforce each other. And in this respect, I would like to, you know, end up to a quote by Weber, a very pessimistic one, but one I also quite like, where he says, I think it's in the as in his essays on the bureau on the sociology of power. He says, what does democracy, what does every democratic movement do? It substitutes a bureaucratic form of power for a personal form of power. So in the place of more traditional personal power relations, every democratic movement puts bureaucratic forms of power, right? So yes, thank you very much again, Pedro, for your wonderful contribution to this discussion.
Yannis, may I respond or? Yeah. Well, absolutely. I think here the fruitful dialogue concerning your last point. I think here the fruitful dialogue would indeed use Lefort against Weber and Weber against Lefort in a sense, because I mean here I think historically the experience of totalitarianism is here a watershed. I mean in the context where Weber was writing, he seemed to be in a sense really let us say mesmerized, fascinated by this rise of bureaucracy, and that somehow this idea to safeguard some space for charismatic authority in the modern age seemed to be crucial to escape like this pervasive force of bureaucracy. But then in hindsight, for Lefort, for someone that actually analyzed the totalitarian experiment and here and the link that could be established between an extreme form of bureaucracy and an extreme form of personality cult, these two could actually coexist. And then he realized how this problem of embodiment could actually reemerge, not in the shape of the ancien regime, but in a new modern, perhaps more radical variant. And then in Lefort emerges like this idea that we have to dwarf this possibility of closure, of absolute closure of the people as one, as he termed it. But at the same time, you need actually to be able to propose some new forms of collective identity, and they are not all necessarily totalitarian, you know. So and perhaps then, you know, the sort of interplay between a charismatic disruptive force that can somehow be embedded in procedures that are formal, that are empty in a sense, substantially empty, So it's precisely this interplay that I think that a transformative politics deals with nowadays. And so I totally agree with you that we can actually fruitful use Lefort against Weber and Weber against Lefort in the context of this discussion. Yes.
Fantastic. Do you want to respond, Yannis, or yeah? So again, raise your hand. So some people are also riding trains and listening to this. You can send your question through the chat, and we'll read it out to Yannis and Pedro. While you think about it, I mean, this dialogue is really fascinating, and both examples, I guess, that's my feeling. I wanted to do. This is a question I wanted to ask you too. It seems Castoriadis is more intent on filling the gaps that Weber leaves than Lefort, right? He's another example of the fact that even if you're not completely aligned with Weber's views, just his antinomies, which Castoriadis will highlight, and his silences exert some kind of force of attraction that you want to fill them somehow. And Castoriadis, it's very interesting that he will mention language, which, I don't know, Edith Hanke has written a book on Weber's language, but Weber on language is, I feel, very limited, right? It's not something he engaged with a lot. This also reminded me of Eric Bostrom's attempt to combine Wittgenstein and Weber, and I think it's very fruitful. This empty space of language could fill certain gaps in his thought that are interesting, or certain contradictions with Weber's concept of culture that comes to fill some voids in his thought. This is also something that Castoriadis highlights, the function that culture ends up playing with this predominance of formal rationality and the psyche, etc., these collective institutions. It's very interesting how he tries to fill the gaps. But with Lefort, I didn't have that feeling, even if, as Pedro was saying, Lefort's contribution for us to, in his dialogue with Weber, I mean, for us as readers of both, is perhaps to the empty space of Weber, which is this question of democracy, a theory of democracy, democratic rulership, if there is such a thing. Even though more and more, I don't know, now that we're in the 6th meeting of this, maybe that is not an empty space for Weber, right? We feel that that's a lack in him with democracy, but I don't. In his thought, that is not an empty space. Right? Lefort would theorize it as an empty space. That's something else, but I don't think that's a gap for Weber himself. It's a gap we see in him, and we try to fill in different ways. But I didn't feel that Lefort's relationship with him was of that nature. Just a very short comment is with the fact that Castoriadis was reading Weber in 44. Of course, there's this mediation with the professor, the student of Rickert, who maybe explains this, but I still feel there's an interesting question of the reception before the post-war period, which is the people who are reading Weber in the shadow of fascism. And so Castoriadis would be one with occupied Greece, but you also have José Medina Echavarria, who flees Spain. He was on the Republican side, flees Spain to Mexico, and is translating Economy and Society in the early 40s into Spanish. And you have Gino Germani, who's also fleeing fascist Italy to Argentina, and also heralds his reception there before the end of the Second World War. And this is, you could say, maybe this is also the case of the Brazilian Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, who's reading Weber, who was in the 20s in Berlin, but is writing on Weber in the 30s, even though it's before the Brazilian dictatorship of Vargas. But this phase of Weber's global reception, I feel, is very underanalyzed, and it's interesting to reflect on why does Weber become interesting in a moment where you have fascism in power, or if that's a coincidence, or if that played a role. Usually the question is rather, did Weber, is he some kind of precursor? And this is usually the question that we ask with regards to Weber and fascism. And I feel it flows into the points that Pedro brought up with what the uses of Weber after the post-war period with the critique of bureaucracy, let's say, on both to the east and to the west, or authoritarian systems in general. So I feel the conversation brought many interesting questions for us to reflect. Let me just see. We have a question in the chat. Is there anyone with their hand raised? No. So let me read the question in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Lucia.
Yeah. I would like to make some questions. Thank you. Thank you both, Yannkis and Pedros. I think that this was wonderful. Interesting. I think that both of you highlight dimensions that we were discussing in our last series events, like domination, bureaucracy, values, and this is so worthy to think moreover. And to bring, thanks for bringing Castoriadis and Lefort to Weber's discussion. I think that always we think Weber and with another author is fruitful, and you have shown this. So you make me think a lot. I have some particular questions for Yannkis. I would like to know where this critique of values, like the critique of values of an individual creation or as a creation of individuals, in which text perhaps Castoriadis developed this. You have shared a text in the blog, but if there are another text, because I am so interested in this values problem, as you know, and I think that this is a problem, and we have to think moreover about this, if values are individuals or the social, or the impact of values, and all the debate about there is a noise. Okay. About the embodiment of values, I think that Pedro talked a lot about this. It's so interesting to think about our contemporary democracies. So this is a question, and I found extremely interesting the deep influence you show that has Weber in Castoriadis, in the plurality of politicalism of values. You quote the early text or the traduction of Economy and Society, and perhaps I want to ask you if you think that this early get in touch from Castoriadis with Weber in this topic of values, and Rickert, Windelband, the value reference, and these topics, perhaps prevent Castoriadis after from forms of authoritarianism or his critique to Stalinism. So this, as Merleau-Ponty says in the Adventures of Dialectic, that Weber was a good liberal. So what do you think about this? And I have a lot of notes, but I will sum up. And for Pedro, I like a lot your interventions. For Pedro, yes, the same question, research question about the text. You mentioned what is bureaucracy, that is from 60s, I think. If there are another text in which Lefort write about bureaucracy in Weber, I would be very interested in that. Perhaps if you can give some more details, you talk about this, but for me it's really interesting. about if you talk a little more about the relationship between democracy and bureaucratization. You said, the empty space on this embodiment, but if democracy, the question would be always have to fight with bureaucracy, and if more democracy always implies less bureaucracy, of how Lefort explain this relationship. The last one is about the modern social science. I think this is a good topic, and the relationship between modern social sciences and democracy. I think, and as Victor said, Edith had present the concept of democracy in Weber. I agree that we can't think in Weber like a democracy in an empty space. But I have a Deutsch exam today, so I have been studying all day, so I mix English or Deutsch. Sorry. And my reflection is, I think that Leo Strauss had write a lot about methodological issues about what is political science, what is political philosophy, what is philosophy. He critiques a lot Max Weber and the political science, all of this. And so Lefort writes a lot about this. And what do you think if we say that perhaps these authors make us think about the relationship between social science and democracy? Weber, I think it is lack of it. So it is democracy, it is social science, but I throw the ball for all of you. But I think that these authors make us more deeply think about the relationship between modern social science, philosophy, and democracy, that perhaps in Weber remains in separated blocks, or they are, but not so development, like these authors, having read Weber, can say, I think. So I hope it be a little clearly, and thanks again.
Thanks so much, Lucia. And I think we've all been there with the German exam, and best of luck to you. Let me just read Rafael's question from the chat, and I'll open the floor back to the two main speakers.
Victor, we cannot hear you. We cannot hear you.
Yeah, now you can, I guess. Sorry then. Thank you for your enlightening contributions. He apologizes for not being able to ask the question directly. That's also his line of research. Rafael Ventura is writing here. And he says, I believe we must resist the temptation to attribute the entire debate on bureaucratization in the 30s to Weber, which is rooted in the socialist tradition, Bakunin versus Marx, and the internal debates within Lenin's succession. If anything, it is Weber who absorbs the theme of bureaucratization within the labor movement through Robert Miches. In the sense, if Risi or Burnham talk about bureaucratization, it does not appear that they have read Weber, nor did Simone Weil. What happens, I believe, is that the debate on the USSR intersects with Weber's thought only after the Second World War, in France with Aron and Merleau-Ponty. Perhaps things are different in Germany with the reception of Weber by Lukács and the Frankfurt School. What do you think? So that's the question from Rafael Ventura. And now we have one by Álvaro. I'll go ahead and read that too. Álvaro Morcillo Raiz. Regarding bureaucracy, it seems to be several channels through which people became interested in Weber. In terms of intellectual history, the Webers found the theme beautifully treated in the 18th of Brumaire, of course, from Marx. Regarding Medina and the Spanish exiles in Latin America, they associated Weber with German democratic, or rather social democratic thinkers, possibly under the influence of the political writings and of the Weber students they knew personally, Mannheim, Löwit, Heller, Morgenthau, Kelsen, Salomon. A last remark, one of us should write on Weber and the leftist intellectual from the European and Latin American periphery. Yes, yeah, I guess the leftist intellectuals from the European Latin American periphery, for sure. Yes, I have a very good Brazilian example too. Great, thanks Alvaro. And if there are no other questions, Yannis, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you everyone. And maybe Alvaro, dear Alvaro, it shouldn't be a book written by one writer, but like a collective work in which each of us could contribute a chapter. I think it would be an amazing idea. So leaving that aside for now, I agree with you regarding bureaucracy and the several channels through which people come to engage with Weber work. And I would also use this as an answer to Rafael's good point. He's right. Maybe we have to see each country as a separate, case, and try to figure out whether Weber was a driving force in the research of bureaucracy and its political implications. However, regarding Castoriadis and Lefort, as we saw, Weber's impact is there. It's a fact. And again, here I would like to stress the point that even in the case of bureaucracy, for Castoriadis as well as for Weber, I think the centrality of meaning is there, right? And I want us to briefly and roughly translate a quote by Castoriadis. He says, the dominance of bureaucracy appears as the most adequate form of bureaucracy of the spirit of capitalism. And here again, Max Weber had seen things much more clearly than Marx. So, and he continues, the spirit of bureaucracy, or as I would say, the magma of the social imaginary significations that the institution of capitalism realizes. So even in the topic of bureaucracy, where someone could say that bureaucracy is a purely technical fact, what does it have to do with meaning, etc. Even there, Castoriadis thinks that bureaucracy realizes, incarnates, presentifies a form of collective meaning, what he calls the magma of the imaginary significations of capitalism. So now, to come to Lucia's question. Yes, Lucia, I've just sent the link of the texts where Castoriadis discusses this topic, among others, the topic of values and value polytheism. I would also like to say that my first book in Greek, but as we speak, it's being translated in English, is exactly on the topic of, it's called The Problem of Foundation of Values, Max Weber and Cornelius Castoriadis. So yes, they do have a very similar approach in this topic. Castoriadis, once again, is more ontological in this respect. He offers an ontological explanation on why values cannot be founded in a rational or a scientific way. But generally speaking, they are very close in this respect too. Hopefully, one day the English version of the book will be out and we can discuss it once again. But I do agree, Lucia, with what you said, that Weber's influence on Castoriadis, even when Castoriadis was a Marxist, prevents him from having a monolithic approach to the social world. And I think what appears very often in Weber's thought, this critique of what he calls the Eindeutigkeit, the monolithic or monocausal idea that there is a factor, and usually in the Marxist frame, the economic factor or the productive forces, etc., that affects the other spheres of life, and that this is a one-way relationship, right? No, there is also a two-way relationship, and of course, this critique of Eindeutigkeit affects Castoriadis both methodologically and politically. Of course, this can also lead to other problems, as Stephen Turner, whom I'm very happy to see here in this discussion, has written. This in Weber's theory can end up in a sort of list of factors. There is a list of factors: the economic factor, the social factor, the political factor, the cultural factor, and everything interacts with everything. So you also have to pay a price for this critique of monocausality and Eindeutigkeit, but still, this exists too in Castoriadis. They are very similar from this respect too. And finally, I'm hoping I do not forget anything. I fully support Victor's idea of, bringing in new writers, new philosophers, Castoriadis, Wittgenstein, and Lefort, in order to complete the gaps Weber has left. They are quite a few. And I would say that Castoriadis' effort to develop an ontology of the social world is moves exactly towards this direction, because Weber has a certain denial towards ontology. And I think Castoriadis is right when he says that, okay, you can have a methodology of social sciences, but there can be no methodology that is completely distinct from an ontology, right? Even if you presuppose not an explicit but an implicit ontology of the social world. But I want to end with this. I think we can also use, so I'm using Castoriadis to read Weber from under a new light, but I'm also using Weber to read Castoriadis under a new light, because so that here again it doesn't go one way, it goes both ways, because Weber can also be used as a critique of Castoriadis. For example, Castoriadis writes again and again, society institutes itself, right? It is this idea of self-institution of society. Society creates its own norms, its own values, its own imaginary significations, etc. And here one can raise the question, what is society? Is it a kind of a subject, that a subject who wants things, needs things, does things? Here, I think that the methodological emphasis of Weber on what has later on been called strict methodological individualism, that even collective entities have been created by people, right? By individual agents. Of course, these individual agents do not do as they please. They are already not only situated, but internally formed by social forces, the social imaginary, etc. But at the end, people, I mean, individuals are those who act. So I just want, I'm not saying I have a solution about the problem of the relationship between society and individual, but I think there is a fruitful antinomy there, and you can use Weber in order to read Castoriadis, but also Castoriadis in order to read Weber. So yes, thank you.
Fantastic, Yannis. Yeah, this question, also a question posed by Tom Campbell, is not only how we read Weber, but how does Weber read us? It's the same gesture, I guess. All right, Pedro, would you like to respond and say some concluding words?
Yes, I fear I will not be able to respond to all the questions and to all the invitations to think through some of these topics, but I would like to say something regarding Rafael Ventura's suggestion, which I think is it's quite interesting here. The role that Michels might have had in putting Weber in contact with this topic of bureaucratization within the labor movement. Because as far as I can remember, the correspondence between Weber and Michels starts in 1904. So, well, I think Edith can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's quite early. And so quite early, and indeed before Weber wrote anything on bureaucracy, there was this engagement with the problem of bureaucracy / oligarchy, because sometimes these terms were used interchangeably by Michels. But I think that there is a fruitful connection there, and also later on, I think it's very interesting when reading what Socialisme and Barbarie, the review published on bureaucracy, that these discussions they were not new in the leftist circles. So really, in the interwar period, you had people like Anton Pannekoek already writing about this, and there seems to have been something that was lost because of the war, and you see these discussions and the problem of bureaucracy being in a sense reiterated here. And then probably Lefort then picks up Weber, probably from maybe Merleau-Ponty or something like that. But perhaps there was the contrary movement that actually Weber picked up this problem from precisely this revolutionary discussion, which is quite interesting here, the dialectics. And thank you, Rafael, for pointing out this this link, and also for your reference in the chat. Then I also wanted to conclude regarding Lucia's question on the relationship between social science and democracy. Here, I think a very interesting input to this discussion by Lefort is this idea that with democracy, there is a sort of disarticulation between different spheres of society. And so within a modern democratic context, you have like the sphere of knowledge, science, the sphere of power, and the sphere of law being somehow disarticulated. And it is this disarticulation that, in a sense, constitutes the condition of possibility of modern social science. This condition of possibility, the social scientists themselves are not aware of this. And this is what is problematic for Lefort. They are not aware of the immersion of social science within a certain, what he would call, political form of society. And this becomes clear when you realize that the place that science occupies in totalitarian societies or which it occupied in the ancien regime was completely different, because there was no such thing as this articulation. And this is his critical view of modern social science. What I am a bit skeptical is that he claims that this naivety, well, he doesn't claim, but by pointing then to Leo Strauss, it seems that Weber has somehow nurtured this naivety. And this is, I think, more questionable. So there, I think it's much more a certain image of Weber that people like Strauss and other critics were able to create in the post-war period, and that it was really influential, and it is that this image that sticks rather than other possible interpretations of Weber. Yeah, so these are my two final cents, and thank you very much for all the questions and the interesting conversation.
Thank you, Pedro. If anyone wants to jump in a last time, just to say that we got from Edith reliably, as always, that the correspondence with Robert Michels began in 1906. And there I would add, yes, if Michels is probably a source for Weber's reflection on bureaucracy, his relationship to German social democracy predates his correspondence with Michels, his contact with Michels. And already before the turn of the century, he said something like, in the Social Democratic Party, the worker finds again the structure of the factory in the hierarchy of the party. And so let's say, because he recognizes that he can operate in that environment. And so there is implicit there already the notion that these structures have some kind of similarity, even if he's not speaking of bureaucracy directly. So, but it's definitely a good pointer to say this is not all originated in Weber. Weber is drinking from the same fountain of these, let's say, left and also anarchists, which he read as well in the 1890s, who have their own critique of bureaucracy already. He will then develop it, and then Michels plays a central role. But his contact with the labor movement and their intellectual tradition and the anarchists is the first-hand one. What else? Rafael Ventura had to leave, but maybe we'll ask him to write something for us for the after the talk that we usually publish, and maybe have a few thoughts from Pedro and Yannkis that they would like to expand on. But otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone that's participated. Thank Yannkis, Ktenas, and Pedro Magalhães for their contributions. Pedro for participating in 2 events in a row, actually. And I think this will probably be the last meeting until after the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. But so I guess this was a very interesting attempt to, even though this network is fundamentally interdisciplinary and we haven't only had, political scientists speaking on Weber, the political theorists, it's been interesting to focus on his work from that standpoint. And we might continue the series after the summer. This is something we have to discuss. Yeah, so I guess I'm going to leave it there. Thanks again to everyone. Thanks for everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Question, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.